In this video, we're going to show an attack from three different perspectives. We'll start with the end user's perspective by seeing how a successful phishing campaign leads to a compromised endpoint. We'll then transition to the attacker's perspective to see how the exploited endpoint leads to harvested credentials. And then we'll conclude by reviewing the aftermath of the attack from the security analyst perspective. In each of the three perspectives, we'll show the different outcomes by comparing an endpoint that is not protected by Attivo to an endpoint that is protected by Attivo. So let's get started. So in this scenario, our end user, Legal 1, is logged onto an endpoint that is not protected by Attivo. Legal 1 has received an email from the IT department stating that a security flaw has been discovered and that a critical update must be immediately applied to resolve the issue. Thankfully, the IT department has provided a convenient link to the update and configured the installation so that a reboot is not required. Even though Legal 1 has been instructed to never click links that request immediate action, Legal 1 forgets their training, clicks the link, and then downloads and applies the update as instructed by the IT department. Once installed, Legal 1 continues working without realizing that the endpoint is now vulnerable to an attack. So let's switch over to our endpoint that is protected by Attivo. And we'll perform the same actions. So it's the same email, it's the same update, it's the same immediate request for action. And so Legal 1 goes and they apply the patch. And then now they continue their work without realizing that this endpoint is also now vulnerable to an attack. So looking at the endpoints with Attivo installed versus without Attivo installed, what we see is the end user's perspective is still the same. So now let's switch over to the attacker's perspective. So now what the attacker will do is they will expose that exploit and make a connection to that endpoint. So on the window to the left is our system that is not protected by Attivo. And then on the window pane to our right is the system that is protected by Attivo. So now once the attacker has made the connection to the endpoints, what they'll do is they'll execute their attack. So the attacker first starts by asking, what user context am I logged in as? And so what we see is the attacker will issue a who am I command, which is a native operating system command. And we'll get back that the actual logged on username is SEDemo. So all of the events that we generate, everything that we perform will be actually logged as events created by SEDemo. So I got two spoiler alerts here. One is a security analyst perspective. What we'll show is that we provided an alert the second that this command was actually issued from the endpoint where Attivo is installed. And then the second spoiler alert is that the commands that we'll show from here on out will produce different results. So now from the system that is not protected by Attivo, the attacker will then query the local administrators group to see if the logged in user account is a member of that local administrators group. And sure enough, what we see is the SEDemo account is in fact a member of this local administrators group on this machine. When we switch over to the system that is protected by Attivo, we'll issue that same command, but notice the difference. What we're now doing is hiding the membership of that local administrators group. So from the attacker's perspective with this basic command, we've hidden those real results. And so that now the attacker's like, okay, from the system that's not protected by Attivo, maybe I don't have local administrator privileges. But that doesn't stop the attacker from continuing with his campaign. So now what we'll do is the attacker will say, okay, give me a listing of the membership for your domain administrators group. So what we've done is we've queried Active Directory, and on the system that's not protected by Attivo, we can see the results. And we see the real domain admin accounts that have been returned. When we issue that same command on the system that is protected by Attivo, what we see is a different outcome. We show that we've hidden the real domain administrators, and we've replaced them with our deceptive domain administrators. So moving along, the attacker then says, okay, give me a listing of your domain controllers. So on the system that's not protected by Attivo, we'll see that that listing is provided back to us along with the 80 sites and services configuration. we'll issue the same command on the system that is protected by Attivo, and we return what looks, in the format of the same, but it's different results. We've hidden the real, and we've replaced with deceptive. On the system that's not protected by Attivo, now what the attacker will do is say, let me go out and query, let me perform a service principal name scan for any hosts that are providing LDAP services, directory services. So what you see is a listing of those servers that are providing that LDAP service. And when we switch over to our system that is protected by Attivo and issue that same command, you can see that we've actually hidden all of those service principal names with that LDAP attribute. So let the fun begin. So now what we'll do is we'll have the attacker go out and actually export credentials from what's stored in memory. So the attacker launches a process called benign.exe. And on the same system, or on the system that's protected by Attivo, we will issue that same command. So we'll show we also run that same process. So what the attacker will want to do is, now that they've harvested those credentials that are in memory, they'll actually want to copy that over to a machine offline and start looking at that. So the attacker maps the drive, they copy the passwords, and on the system that is protected by Attivo, we perform the same action. We copy that document that has those passwords embedded within it. And then now what the attacker will do is he'll clean up after himself. So now he'll say, okay, let me remove the map drive and let me remove that passwords file. We'll perform the same action on the system that is protected by Attivo. So now what you see is, from the attacker's perspective, it looks to be the same actions, right? We've provided the information back on both systems. However, what's drastically different is, on the system that is protected by Attivo, we've actually provided back deceptive information. So let's go actually look at the outcome, the results of what the attacker issued. So we'll open up our documents. And so if you'll remember, one of the domain administrators in the domain admins group was actually administrator. And if you like fried fish, check this out. What we see is that domain administrator's password is fried fish. Now, when we start looking at the system that was protected, we saw a member of that domain administrators group, Scott Lane. And so now, from the attacker's perspective, I have a domain admin account with password with a listing of the domain controllers. And so now, from the attacker's perspective, I own that environment in both locations. But what's different is, when the attacker follows those lures, what they'll see is they will log into our deceptive environment. So now let's transition over to our security analyst perspective. Let's see what kind of events and results get generated from this type of activity. So we log into the Attivo platform, and what you can see is immediately we are classifying these events into a multitude of different areas. So you can see here we've taken the events and we've actually classified those into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And you can see the different phases of that framework. We've classified them down into phases. We've also set up the events by severity. Now, if we were to go and look at the events, what we'll see is we have a number of different alerts coming from this endpoint. And we see some Active Directory alerts, some system alerts. And so, to kind of look at some of these specific alerts, what we'll show is we actually had the attacker at Who Am I. So when we start looking at through these alerts, what we'll find is we'll go in, we can actually show the binary and the process along with the query that generated from the endpoints. Then what we start to notice is some AD privileged group enumeration. So same thing, we're going to populate that binary in the process along with the query that generated those alerts. And then the very interesting alert here is our credential dumping alert. When we populate that out, what you'll actually see is when the attacker ran the benign.exe process, what they actually did was renamed and rehashed the Mimikatz executable. We'll also provide that SHA-2 hash accompanying with that executable that was launched. Expand this, and you'll see that we have a direct mapping to that MITRE attack framework. So we have the OS credential dumping. So we see the sub-techniques. We can expand that out. This is all part of the MITRE attack framework. And it gives the analyst rather, a link to all of the different APTs that this type of activity has been seen. So now the analyst is like, oh no, something is drastically wrong here. Let's go in and let's isolate that endpoint. So I can drop down directly from the attacker point of view, and I can set, or the analyst point of view, and I can click Attivo blocking. That will immediately isolate the endpoint, so that it's no longer allowed to make external network connections. We also have the ability to integrate with our partners. And so if you have specific blocking technologies, you can also integrate with items like Palo Alto, CrowdStrike, Cisco. So I can create that integration, and then when I create that integration, what I can also do is automate the response. If I see a severity of medium or higher, I can enable that. So as soon as that event is reported, we send it over to that blocking technology to perform the endpoint isolation. So when we look at this from a security analyst perspective that does not have Attivo, it becomes, there come several questions. How would I identify this activity? Would the attacker be able to gain those privileged credentials? And when would I actually get alerted with that? With Attivo, we're providing those alerts immediately out of the gate. So I hope this video has been informative. Thank you for your time. Have a good day.